January 1st, 1863 marked a pivotal moment in American history with the issuance of the Emancipation Proclamation, a document that profoundly reshaped the meaning and trajectory of the Civil War. While often misunderstood as a blanket abolition of slavery, the proclamation was more nuanced, targeting only slaves in Confederate states not under Union control, excluding both occupied Southern territories and border states. Despite its limitations, the proclamation was a powerful declaration of intent, requiring Northern military enforcement to be effective. It not only symbolized a shift in the war's purpose from preserving the Union to fighting for freedom, but also opened the doors for black men to join the Union Army and Navy, leading nearly 200,000 to enlist and fight for their rights. As the war progressed, the proclamation's impact extended beyond the battlefield, influencing international perceptions and ultimately contributing to the abolition of slavery with the passage of the 13th Amendment. This momentous shift in policy and purpose underscored the evolving nature of the conflict, transforming it into a struggle not just for unity, but for human freedom itself. The war was not progressing as President Lincoln had anticipated. Consequently, as conscription was implemented in the North, both factions readied themselves for renewed conflict. The Union had two primary objectives: to defeat General Lee and capture Richmond, as well as to seize Vicksburg, thereby gaining complete control over the Mississippi River. The latter goal posed a significant threat to the South, which had been struggling to secure its Tennessee border. The presence of the Mississippi, Tennessee, and Cumberland rivers complicated efforts to keep Northern forces at bay. Additionally, General Grant had already taken command of the Tennessee and Cumberland rivers following the capture of Fort Henry and Fort Donelson. Union Admiral David Farragut had also secured New Orleans, effectively isolating the Confederates from the Gulf of Mexico, while the capture of Memphis had nearly wrested control of the Mississippi from the south. However, without Vicksburg, full control remained elusive. Grant was resolute in his intention to capture both the city and the river. In the summer of 1862, he made his initial attempt alongside General William T. Sherman, but this early effort culminated in a significant defeat and retreat at the Battle of the Chickasaw Bayou. Nevertheless, the Northerners were prepared to make another attempt by the following spring. Up to that point, Grant and his forces had faced considerable challenges in accessing Vicksburg due to the surrounding swamps, bayous, and seemingly impenetrable terrain. Demonstrating both innovation and determination, Grant directed his men to address these obstacles. For several weeks, they drained bayous, constructed bridges, and established usable roads to reach the city. Marching along their newly created route through Louisiana and across the river, Grant and his army advanced into battle. Rear Admiral David Dixon Porter was called upon by the general to provide naval support along the river for the land troops. Despite enduring heavy fire from Confederate defenses, Porter and his men navigated the perilous situation with remarkable resilience, sustaining the loss of just one ship while offering essential support to Grant. By April 29, 1863, all forces were in place and prepared to initiate the assault. Grant's strategy was outlined as follows. Sherman would be dispatched to simulate an attack at Snyder's Bluff. Colonel Benjamin Garrison was assigned to conduct a raid further inland to divert Confederate troops from Vicksburg. Meanwhile, Porter would continue to bolster the land forces, and Major General John A. McClernand, along with his 13th Army Corps, would aim for a landing on the eastern bank of Grand Gulf, which was heavily fortified with Confederate defenders. Despite the challenges, Grant remained confident in his approach. The operation commenced with Porter and his gunboats opening fire around 8 a.m., targeting Fort Wade, followed by Fort Coburn and their defenses. The Confederate forces quickly retaliated with their own artillery, igniting a battle that would extend for hours into the afternoon. The Union Navy ultimately subdued Fort Wade. However, they encountered difficulties with the more resilient Fort Coburn. Despite their initial success against the first fort, Porter and Grant ultimately decided to withdraw, recognizing the second line of defense as insurmountable. The Battle of Grand Gulf concluded, marking another setback for Grant. As Vicksburg appeared increasingly unattainable, the general remained undeterred. While Grant focused on Vicksburg, Union General Joseph Hooker was assigned to address the challenge posed by General Lee in the North. Hooker also harbored ambitions of capturing the Confederate capital, but first he needed to eliminate the formidable Virginian. Consequently, Hooker and his army of 115,000 prepared to confront Lee's diminished force of only 60,000. The Union commander divided his troops into three segments, dispatching two-thirds to Fredericksburg to simulate an attack, while he led the remaining forces toward the actual target. Lee, anticipating the challenges ahead, opted for a calculated risk given his numerical disadvantage. He initially allocated 10,000 of his 60,000 troops to General Jubal Early, who would oversee the defense of Fredericksburg. Meanwhile, Lee retained the remaining 50,000 soldiers to confront Hooker's Army of the Potomac. A fierce battle commenced in a forest just west of Chancellorsville. Despite having a significant numerical advantage and previous enthusiasm, Hooker unexpectedly commanded his forces to retreat into defensive positions, inadvertently granting Lee a tactical advantage. In a further audacious maneuver, the Confederate general divided his forces once more, dispatching his trusted associate Stonewall Jackson with a contingent to flank the Union's left side. Jackson led his men directly into combat against the Union 11th Corps. Concurrently, Lee became aware of an advancing Union force to the east, prompting him to again split his troops to engage the attackers near Salem Church. The overall outcome of the battle was an unforeseen and remarkable Confederate victory. However, the South would soon suffer a significant loss with the death of Stonewall Jackson. While returning to camp under the cover of darkness, the 18th North Carolina Infantry Regiment mistakenly opened fire, believing the approaching group to be Union soldiers. In the ensuing chaos, Jackson was shot 3 times, twice in the left arm and once in the right hand. He would later undergo amputation of his left arm and succumb to pneumonia complications shortly thereafter. General Lee's response underscored the profound impact of this loss on the South. "I have lost my right arm. I'm bleeding at the heart." Following this costly victory, the Confederates sought to achieve further diplomatic success. In response to the Emancipation Proclamation, Jefferson Davis reinforced his previous declarations through the enactment of the Retaliatory Act, which permitted the execution of black soldiers from the North along with their white commanders. This significant political maneuver was soon followed by a series of armed confrontations. The Battle of Raymond resulted in a Union victory in Mississippi, while the outcome of the Battle of Jackson was less clear-cut. Meanwhile, Ulysses S. Grant was diligently working to clear the way to his primary objective. He informed William T. Sherman that the route to Vicksburg was now accessible and requested additional troops. Confederate leaders found themselves embroiled in disagreements regarding their next strategy, which allowed the Union forces to capitalize on the situation. This led to the crucial Battle of Champion Hill, also referred to as the Hill of Death by Alvin P. Hovey in retrospect. The Union emerged victorious, marking a significant advancement for Grant in his campaign against Vicksburg. Following this success, the Union achieved another victory at the Battle of the Big Black River Bridge, intensifying the pressure on Vicksburg as Union forces prepared to lay siege to the city. The construction of 15 miles of trenches commenced as the siege of Vicksburg began. Grant was optimistic that this time, the city would fall into his hands. The siege commenced on May 18th, encircling the Confederate troops, numbering 29,000 and led by General John C. Pemberton, along with the civilian population of Vicksburg. Cut off from supplies and subjected to relentless bombardment, Pemberton and the remaining defenders surrendered after 47 days on July 4, 1863. Grant's aspirations were realized. He had captured Vicksburg and, consequently, gained control of the Mississippi River. However, significant events unfolded elsewhere during his campaign. The Battle of Brandy Station in Virginia occurred in early June, marking the largest cavalry engagement of the entire war. The confrontation concluded with Union forces being thwarted, and just days later, the Battle of Second Winchester successfully expelled the Union troops from the Shenandoah Valley. It appears that Grant experienced more favorable circumstances than his fellow commanders, although the Union achieved a significant victory on June 20th when West Virginia was officially admitted as a new state. This development provided the Northerners with a reason to celebrate. However, mere days later, just hours before Grant would capture Vicksburg, one of the most tragic events in the war in American history was about to unfold. The Battle of Gettysburg. General Robert E. Lee was the architect of this offensive. Aiming to shift the conflict away from the war-weary Virginia, Lee sought to bring the battle directly to the north, beginning in Pennsylvania. Leading an army of 75,000, Lee advanced into Union territory, pursued by Union General George Gordon Meade and his 95,000 troops. The two forces continued their march until they reached Gettysburg, where Lee halted to prepare for the impending assault. Meanwhile, Confederate Major General Henry Heth was en route to join Lee when his troops encountered those of Union Brigadier General John Buford. Buford opened fire, unexpectedly igniting the battle. The Confederates responded effectively to the Union's gunfire, pushing the Northern forces back along Chambersburg Pike. Although their advance was momentarily halted, the Southerners were not deterred. Union Major General John F. Reynolds' and 11th Corps soon arrived to bolster Buford's position, but their efforts proved insufficient. Reynolds was tragically shot in the neck just as the conflict intensified, while additional Confederate reinforcements joined the fray. Generals Robert Rhodes and Jubal Early engaged the Union forces nearby, and together the Confederates began to encircle the Union troops in Gettysburg. As the Union line began to crumble, many soldiers managed to escape via a nearby railroad, while others found themselves trapped in the town. The remaining defenders chose to regroup on Cemetery Hill to the south. In a defensive formation resembling a fishhook, Union soldiers remain encircled by Confederate forces. Yet the battle is not yet decided. Union General Dan Sickles takes action by advancing his 3 corps to Emmitsburg Road and the Peach Orchard, where they encounter Confederate troops led by General James Longstreet. Sickles' strategy quickly falters, prompting General Meade to deploy all 5 of his corps to provide support. As Longstreet intensifies his assault on the Union left flank, General Lee directs Hill to engage in the center and General Richard Ewell to attack the right flank. Longstreet's forces strike Sickles near Devil's Den and Little Round Top, but to their surprise, the Union manages to bring in additional reinforcements. Conversely, at the Peach Orchard, Sickles' troops suffer significantly, with casualties mounting alarmingly as the second day of battle continues. The Union quickly fills the void left by the reinforcements sent to assist Sickles and successfully pushes back the Confederates in the center. On the right, Generals Ewell and Early attempt to dislodge the Union defenders on and around Cemetery Hill as night approaches. Initially, the Union holds firm, but the Confederates soon overpower the defenders. However, Northern reinforcements soon arrive to renew the fight on the hill. Meanwhile, Confederate General Edward Johnson launches an assault on the Union's far right at Culp's Hill. With many troops dispatched to other areas, Union General George Greene finds himself with only 1,300 men to confront 4,500 Confederates. Despite the numerical disadvantage, Greene's forces remain resilient. As the second day draws to a close, Gettysburg has already become the bloodiest battle of the Civil War, with little hope for improvement on the third day. As dawn breaks, General Lee sends reinforcements to his troops at Culp's Hill, but General Meade does the same. The situation has shifted, leaving the Confederates at a disadvantage in terms of numbers. Despite the circumstances, the Confederates engage, initiating a 7-hour offensive. Initially, they appear to have the upper hand, but by midday, the momentum shifts in favor of the Union forces. Instead of reinforcing the right flank, Lee opts for a full-scale assault on the Union left, a strategy that Meade had astutely anticipated, marking the first time he successfully outmaneuvered Robert E. Lee. The central attack evolves into the largest artillery bombardment ever witnessed in the Western Hemisphere, a remarkable display yet ultimately fruitless for the Confederates. As the Southern troops are compelled to traverse a mile of exposed terrain across Emmitsburg Road, the Union forces unleash a devastating barrage, dismantling the Confederate advance while Lee insists on continuing the assault. The Confederates make a desperate attempt to breach the Union rear with an offensive, led by General Jeb Stuart, but this effort also fails. The entire Southern offensive is disintegrating on all fronts, and it soon becomes evident that the Union has triumphed in the Battle of Gettysburg. Reluctantly acknowledging this reality, Lee retreats toward the Potomac and back into Virginia. Reports suggest that during the withdrawal, he confided to his men that the situation was entirely his responsibility. He felt this so profoundly that he later offered his resignation to President Jefferson Davis, a sentiment justified by the staggering casualties incurred during the campaign. His efforts to carry the war into Northern Territory resulted in losses so severe that the number of wounded surpassed the town's civilian population by a ratio of 12 to 1. By the conclusion of the 3-day battle, Over 50,000 soldiers were either killed, injured, or missing. Homes and churches were repurposed as hospitals for the injured, and the town bore the scars of conflict, with bullet holes marking its structures. A portion of the battlefield would soon be designated as a national cemetery for the Union's fallen soldiers, while the slain Confederates were not afforded the same honor. Following the devastating events at Gettysburg, the Union's victory was largely overshadowed by the tragedy of the battle and the ongoing conflict. Additionally, the enthusiasm surrounding the 54th Massachusetts Colored Infantry, the first African-American volunteer regiment to engage in combat, was dampened by the subsequent draft riots. Frustrated New Yorkers, who believed the conscription system disproportionately favored the wealthy, began to assault draft offices and black churches, leading to a rapid escalation of unrest. The situation in the South was equally dire, as the war severely strained its economy and raised concerns about the sustainability of their efforts. Throughout July, skirmishes and minor confrontations persisted. By the end of the month, President Lincoln issued General Order 252, which mandated that for every black U.S. prisoner of war executed by the Confederacy, a Confederate prisoner would be executed in retaliation. As tensions escalated, the Confederates reacted poorly. On August 21, 1863, Lawrence, Kansas, became the target of a brutal raid led by rebel guerrillas under William Clark Quantrill, resulting in a horrific massacre. Much of the town was set ablaze, and at least 160 men and boys were killed. This incident transcended conventional warfare, representing a large-scale act of homicide that illustrated the profound anger and desperation felt by many in the South as the conflict continued and the Confederacy struggled to maintain its position. Consequently, the Union forces soon captured Chattanooga, Tennessee. In a different theater, the Confederates experienced a moment of optimism with a victory at the Battle of Chickamauga, which General Braxton Bragg followed by initiating a siege on Union-held Chattanooga. Meanwhile, in Virginia, Generals Lee and Meade engaged in combat during the Bristoe Station campaign. Abraham Lincoln delivered the Gettysburg Address during the dedication of the Soldiers' National Cemetery. At that time, General Lee aimed to prolong the Confederate war efforts sufficiently to sway Northern morale, hoping to influence the election in favor of a Southern sympathizer against Lincoln in the upcoming re-election. Unfortunately for the Confederates, the siege of Chattanooga ultimately failed, forcing General Bragg to retreat into Georgia, while another Confederate attempt to besiege Knoxville also proved unsuccessful. Although the South had initially entered the war with strength, it appeared that the North's technological advantages were beginning to yield results. Both factions desired an end to the conflict, yet neither was prepared to concede. Lee's strategy still had potential, but Lincoln presented an alternative proposition to any Confederate willing to accept it. Take an oath of allegiance to the United States, and your past actions as a rebel would be forgiven. Thank you for watching. Please consider liking and subscribing to History Empire Center.